Hey everyone, thanks to all of our listeners who listen to the Banking on Experience podcast on a weekly and daily basis. We appreciate it. We love you guys. Hopefully you guys can keep coming back. We keep providing good content. Today we're going to be talking about banking on a winning strategy, and we're going to be specifically focused on data, so stay tuned. All right, welcome to the podcast, everybody. I'm your host, James Gilbert. Today, we are super excited to be joined by Joey Rudisill. Joey, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks a lot for having me, James.
Joey, I don't like to do my guests a disservice in introducing them. I'd love for you to introduce yourself and your credit union.
Oh, thanks a lot. Yeah, my name's Joey Rudisill. I'm the Chief Information Officer at Central Willamette Credit Union. We're a couple hours south of Portland in Albany, Oregon, the Central Willamette Valley.
I'm particularly excited because you work at a credit union, and talking about data is something that I think is very underutilized, so I'm especially excited about that. Let's start off by talking about what you feel like the role of data is for not just a credit union, but just for businesses in general. And why do you think it's important?
We look at the role of data as really being central to our strategy. There's been a lot of discussion over the years and about financial institutions and how well they either do or do not leverage data to help serve their customers, to help drive their business forward. And I think it's pretty universally recognized at this point in time that data really is central and should be central to decision making. At Central Willamette, though, we really capitalize on the data that we have and really put it to work. And so about a year ago, we started doing just that, is developing a strategy to make data central to our decision-making and make it available to all levels of our organization.
I could tell you from my perspective on the challenge of getting alignment with data, but what do you think from your perspective is a big challenge that credit unions face in trying to get alignment just to have that be a centralized focus point?
Well, there are a number of challenges. Not the which of least is collecting the data and getting it organized so that it can be used. But let's talk at a slightly different level. Some of the challenges in data are at the governance level, at the sponsorship level, at the role and the importance that it's given within the organization, the resources that are committed to it. For data to really be used and to be powerful, it has to be a priority for the organization, because everything that we do produces data, right? And most of what we do is captured in those systems. But as we all have different ways of doing things, or maybe our processes are inconsistent throughout our organization, that can produce slightly different results within the data. And those different results create a situation where data becomes difficult to trust or difficult to understand. So much of really using data is about the processes that create it in the first place. And it's not a situation where you can just take the results of all the data that you've created and turn around and put it into some analytics engine and it's going to give you an answer. You have to refine your processes so that the data going in is consistent and in line with what you're trying to achieve with your business.
I love what you just said, because I think that so often, and this goes across just about every organization that I've ever dealt with too, and that's the fact that systems don't talk to each other. The data entry, to your point, at that level is very rarely done in a cohesive manner. If you have different functions that are working with data in different ways, they're going to translate that data in different ways, and then it doesn't flow. You have all this data dispersed everywhere, and the functions of the business are not talking to each other. And I think that that's a big misstep that people have, is we used to call it almost like a data charter, where you would get decision makers from each function of the business where the data was going to be touched and where it was going to be inputted. And you would have those functions of the business have a seat at the table while you're building your architecture out. And that was always a really, really powerful way to try and get the right people, first of all, just to get buy off, but second of all, to kind of help everybody understand how the data should and shouldn't flow in some cases.
One of the things that we did, James, in developing a data strategy that I think is so important to what you're saying, and that is we have a data strategy team that represents every level of the organization, from the CEO down to every teller that we have and everything in between. And that cross-functional team is really responsible for driving this strategy forward. And what happens in that process when you create a truly cross-functional team and multi-level team is they begin to experience the process of discovery, the experience of understanding, the experience of a realization of what it means to have data and to take and to aggregate it and to assess it and take action on it, what it means for their own processes that produce the data. And therefore, that ownership and discovery process creates an excitement throughout this organization. And it's been really amazing what we've seen come out of this team, of this cross-functional team. We have seen people get excited about data and what they can now do that we would have never imagined. And I think that as organizations consider a data strategy and look at really leveraging their data, they need to be open to the idea that a governance layer is critically important, but you have to create an environment to let people come out of the woodwork and really bloom and grow into the value that you're sitting there on top of.
I love what you just said. I look at this from a marketing perspective because that's my background, but it's so interesting to me how much data marketing has, and they rarely are able to share it across the organization in an actionable way. And I mean, to your point, right? It's very rare that marketing's going to ever build the data strategy. That's just not going to happen, right? But yet here marketing is holding and sourcing so much consumer data, digital behavior data. I mean, you name it, right? And then on top of that, you have these external systems that then bring in additional data insight into that, like the stuff that you're getting from loan applications, the stuff that you're getting from credit card applications, the PII data. That stuff can't necessarily be used from a marketing perspective, but it can certainly be used to empower the organization to do better things.
Without a doubt. And, and that almost begs kind of a question of what data is important? What data should you keep? What data should your institution be working with or trying to tie in or pull together? And I think we've passed this point where we've embarked in this new world of predictive analytics where it's almost impossible to say what data, that anything's irrelevant. Maybe it's irrelevant today. Maybe it's irrelevant to the immediate question that you're trying to answer. Maybe you don't even understand quite how some data might be used. But at this point in time, with the possibilities of predictive analytics and machine learning and what has taken place, and the fact that we are just getting started to incorporate these capabilities into our business and into our lives, it's almost impossible to say that anything's not relevant at this point. And we're certainly taking an approach that storage is cheap, hold on to the data. If it becomes useful, we'll have it. If it's not useful, we can make that decision somewhere down the road.
Let's talk a little bit about the journey that you've been on, because you've just recently gone through a pretty big initiative at your credit union. So let's talk about that a little bit. Who was involved in your org? Who needed to be involved? What support did you need internally to do it? What steps did you undertake to launch it?
Driven by our CIO is the sponsor, and governed then at the VP level. We hired, I think, a couple of consultants to help us develop an initial data strategy because we wanted a roadmap. We wanted something that was actionable. We wanted it to be prioritized by business need. We wanted to understand the timeline. We wanted to be able to have targets every point along the way. So we hired some consultants to help us through that process and untangling all of the questions that people want answers to when you start asking them, what can you do with your data? As I mentioned, the cross-functional team, we involved that cross-functional team at every level of the organization in that strategic planning process. So they were in it right from the get-go. So while we had a CEO sponsor and we had broad participation across our entire organization at the C-suite level, we also had those individuals at every level of the organization participate and learn and grow through that process. So what we really like to say is that we developed a data strategy that was both top-down and bottom-up, and I truly believe that to be the case. And I think that is just really important because as every level of the organization produces the data that you're ultimately going to use, you want buy-in from every level of the organization in order to produce the best results that you can possibly get. And so as we embarked on our strategy, we did just that. We created a top-down and bottom-up. We created a roadmap, and that roadmap was about an 18-month roadmap. There was no point that we saw in going out too much further than that, other than pure vision and direction. But we created an 18-month actionable roadmap that we are implementing today. The teams meet every week. Individual sub-teams meet on top of that, and we dedicate a lot of resources to the effort. We measure ourselves and our progress. And as I said, we started our data strategy, really pulling it together about a year ago. And we are now at the point where we're starting to really produce results and, in fact, rolling out some of the first dashboard tools to our staff actually just this week.
That's amazing. I want to carve something out that you had mentioned that I think is an important point for us to discuss. And that's, how did you get your CEO to buy off on this? How did he become the champion, or he or she become the champion?
Well, she, our CEO, and she became the champion. I don't think it was a tough sell. I mean, I think that there's enough published about the value of data. There has been for a long time. There's a broad recognition that financial institutions are, have some of the most, frankly, desired data. I guess. I mean, that consumer behavior, the financial transactions, so on and so forth. So, I don't really think that was a tough sell. I think really the more difficult part was just organizing the effort and getting something going that would be sustainable and meaningful and not kind of peter out after a short period of time. And, and I think that really required the champion to push it. And, I was one of those champions. I'm passionate about it. I enjoy it. I like data. I like working with it. I enjoy imagining what we can do and envisioning what this can become. And so, it's always good to have a good, strong champion who will continue to drive that forward. And, that's how we did it in our case.
Joey, I feel like you could put on a workshop around this stuff. I mean, you're building out a pretty good framework here. Talking about building out almost like a charter of people that can be both top and bottom down. Talking about executive sponsorship. You're talking about making sure that those champions are involved in every part of the strategy. I mean, this is a really good framework here that people could take away.
It is. I do think that we have a successful formula. I personally have talked to probably at least a dozen credit unions at this point about their data strategies. And I really do think that we lean, as credit unions do so well. They turn to their peers, they gain what they can from their learning experiences and try to make good decisions from there. And I think that we really, truly did do that. One of the key components of our strategy is the concept of a data dictionary. And I think that this is so core to a successful data strategy. And what that dictionary does, it helps our organization establish a common language. And it's so funny that we spend more time debating, the meaning of a single word that we all took for granted as understanding our own selves, and yet maintain these variations of understanding. And only when we go through this process of refining the word and truly writing down on paper what this particular word means, do we get to the point to where everyone shares that understanding. And our language starts to evolve. And quite literally, word by word, we come to a new and common and shared understanding of each word to then apply that to the next word that we need to come to a common understanding of. And I think before that, we took for granted so many times these basic ideas of, in credit union land, what is a member? What is an account? What is a transaction? What is a loan? And it sounds so simple at first, but when you really start picking that apart and get everyone's version of what that means, you realize that there's a lot of room for error as we go about our daily lives. And so by refining our language, we're able to eliminate the possibilities of that level of error. So that process alone is really an exercise in pushing our credit union forward in order to move the data strategy forward.
We've talked about some of the challenges that credit unions might face with this, but if you had to pick like one or two of the top two challenges, what would they be?
Well, certainly the technology and those technologies decisions can be a challenge. There can be different ideas and some of these solutions are not cheap. And so you might be making some, pretty hefty upfront investment in that. So you certainly have that to consider. Something I mentioned a little earlier about the processes, though, I think is one that we certainly did not anticipate, and did not anticipate the degree at which processes would come into play in our data strategy.
For the more simplified audience, what do you mean by process?
So, for example, let's say that a CD got funded. One of our members opened up a CD. The member comes into our branch and they want to fund the CD with a combination of a personal check, a deposit that they're bringing in, and partially funded by a savings account that they already have with us. And so our wonderful tellers go to work and they fund that CD with both of those mechanisms. Well, it just so happens that in the system, that represents 2 transactions of partially funding a CD instead of one CD being fully funded. So in that case, what needed to actually happen is we needed to take the deposit, put it in the deposit account, and then open the CD with a single transaction from the deposit account. That initial CD did not get recorded as being a funded CD. Now, there are examples all over like this, in where variations in just how we behave and the ways that we go about working in the systems, those variations can create different outcomes. And so wrestling with what is true has become a very interesting question. Is it true that the CD was funded? Well, yes. Is it true that it was partially funded? Well, yes, that's also true. And so what is true, what happened versus what was intent has become a very interesting question. And what we are finding is that rather than changing our analysis, it's better to change our processes to be more consistent throughout our organization. And I think that has a lot of benefits beyond just the data that it produces.
I completely agree with you. And I'm glad that you explained the process for everyone, because I think that even that term can kind of get confusing to people. They're thinking process. Well, what does he mean by process? Is it on the member side? Is it on the employee side? Well, actually, it's really both. When you work with data, you have to think through the member and you have to think through the employee. You have to think through both, because the process and data flow and the systems that are used to do that, to your point, sometimes don't talk to each other. And that's where you've got to try and make those ties. So look, every credit union has a core system. Sometimes it's outdated. Sometimes it's top notch. Let's talk about that for a second. What do you think are some challenges, or what do you think that credit unions can do to better empower the core system and help the data flow? Because to your point, that one process that you just talked about probably included many different systems that the core was trying to operate.
Yeah, it's, there's no one answer to that, James. It's everyone will have to kind of wrestle with that themselves. Core systems have come in such a variety of flavors. Processes are, quite infinite. And every credit union financial institution will have to wrestle with the availability of their data. Legacy systems can create opportunities for duplicate data, which can cause a lot of overhead in trying to clean up the data and trying to remove duplicates and make the data useful. Even we're on a modern system, and that can be a challenge still, is data integrity and data cleanliness. That is just an ugly part of data analytics and your data strategy is tying the systems together, getting them in a format where the data can be associated with one another, getting the data clean to a point to where you're happy with it. There's just no easy answer to that. Now, what I will say, though, rather than leaving it hanging there, is that I do think that there are some technology solutions that can really help that along the way. And I think that there are approaches that can really help that effort. And traditionally, the kind of go-to technology solution was your data warehouse. And that's where you bring all the data in and try to, normalize it and tie it all in together and make it meaningful and useful. And I think the data warehouse accomplishes that. But the data warehouse also requires a lot of upfront design. And an evolution of the data warehouse, not a replacement of, but an evolution, is a concept known as a data lake. And the data lake allows you a little more flexibility in your data strategy. It requires a little less upfront design and decision making and allows you to use your data really driven more on use cases, on business cases that are more immediate now. So you really end up just using the data that you need right now in order to make a decision instead of trying to design a warehouse and understand how that data is going to fit into the grand scheme of things. And that's really the path that we've chosen. Now, these things are not mutually exclusive, but the data lake approach and technology does help you get there a little faster than you might otherwise.
I love the fact that you mentioned that because I think that, well, and also to your point earlier on the fact that just dealing with duplicates alone is a nightmare. I remember doing a consulting gig for a really large organization and having to do their dedupes, and they had over 1 million dedupes that we had to do. And it was insane. It's not something that I take lightly at all, from having to be in the thick of actually looking at that. And there's only so much automation you can do too. Some of it does require a human eye. You've got to look at it. But you also have this influx of data that is now consumed across the world because of COVID. And it's very rarely related to a company email address versus a personal email address, where they might have several personal email addresses, several different phone numbers, different addresses. I mean, we're dealing with a whole influx of data that I don't think businesses are used to dealing with now. So how do we separate the useless data from the really important stuff?
I think it just has to be driven by business need. You really have to set your business priorities and then turn to your data to help you to address those priorities. I spoke about the data lake. I am not one who likes to delete data. I'd rather set it aside for a later day when I might need it down the road. I see no reason not to do that. But with the data lake approach especially, I don't need to incorporate all of that data into a meaningful and useful format. I can set it aside. It can be there for future use without me having to spend my time or money to address it. The data lake approach allows me to use the data that I need now in order to answer the question. So I suggest you hold on to all of your data and use what you need right now.
I'm actually really glad that you mentioned that part too, because I think that fits into another question that I had for you. In the credit union's core is to serve their member and to try to provide the best experience that they possibly can. Credit unions are notorious for trying to create a really good experience for people. So I have a million different ways that I feel like credit unions could use the data, right? But what are some ways that you're seeing credit unions use and leverage data to improve the member experience overall?
So we are a year into our data strategy, and that I feel is fairly early. We put a lot of work into it, and we are a year into it, and still with all of that, I feel like we're just getting started. So it takes time. What I'm doing is setting the stage for where we really see ourselves going and the value that we hope to provide back to our members through data. As we develop this over time, I think the real opportunity is to turn from analyzing our products and services and looking at the success of a product or the fees that have been charged or whether rates are right or whether a branch is performing, how our CDs are performing, whatever the case may be, loans, and evolving beyond that into using predictive analytics to help our members avert potential disasters, help guide our members with our use of predictive analytics to give them insights and actions that will be helpful and beneficial to them based on the mass data in our systems, all of our members' behavior, and what we're able to derive out of that. I think that's our real opportunity in data analytics, where we become the tool to help them recognize good decisions and help them get in front of it and have good, healthy financial lives. That's
what would create the best member experience, is when you can actually save them from the harm that they might do themselves financially. That's the ultimate goal. Let's talk a little bit about the last kind of subject that I wanted to talk about was we often talk about this notion of making sure that we can create fans at a credit union and making sure that we have almost like a family feel. So tell us, it doesn't have to be a credit union. It doesn't even have to be in the banking or financial services space. What's a business that just does really, really well, not only with data, but makes you feel like family with what they have provided to you?
Well, fortunately, I think that we got a little bit lucky because in our strategy, we chose to run with Amazon as one of our primary providers in our data strategy. And I have been absolutely astounded at their level of customer service. I knew that their tools were powerful. I knew that they were a leader in cloud technologies, and I knew that they were doing great things and building business service upon business service. But what I didn't know before we got into a direct relationship with them is that as small as Central Willamette Credit Union is to Amazon, I have bragged about it on many occasions that they continue like we are their best customer. It's really been something to see that in action. And so Amazon has been a great partner for ours in our data strategy. We're able to use their professional services that have been phenomenal. They've helped guide us along the way. Certainly use the technology. We're building our strategy in the cloud. And Amazon's just been a great partner.
I love that because, I think that more credit unions can also use that as a use case to don't be afraid to leverage your members and talk about them. Like if they're a really, really good member, like use that to your advantage and make sure that they become an advocate for you. I mean, the fact that you're on here talking about Amazon and they didn't even ask you to.
No, of course not.
What's more powerful of a marketing message than that? Nothing is better than that.
Yeah, it is true. And they have a reputation for good customer service, and we have certainly seen that.
Well, Joey, I appreciate you taking the time today. We're at time. Thank you so much for being a guest. We hope to have you on again soon.